Good day. We're going to look at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol. Um, Basically, this slideshow is developed by the United Nations Committee on the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. And so we're just speaking to this slideshow because it's really excellent and great material. So the outline of our presentation and of the slideshow from the United Nations looks at the convention timeline. What is the convention? Paradigm shift involved, which is the shift of our perspectives. The definition of disability, general principles, articles, and rights in the convention, international cooperation, accessibility of organizations and their activities, monitoring, implementation within the United Nations, and a note on the special rapporteur and the conclusion. The convention timeline looks around 2006. And the first committee session on the rights of people with disabilities was in 2008. So we're seeing a very interesting timeline. It's not all that long ago. And the convention builds upon and works in synergy with previous international texts that were related to people with disabilities. These were including the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities and the World Program of Action on Disabled Persons. The convention was felt to be necessary as a response to the overlooked development challenge that is in many countries. Approximately 10% of the world's population are persons with disabilities, and that's over 650 million people, approximately 80% of whom live in developing countries. A response to the fact that although pre-existing human rights conventions offer considerable potential to promote and protect the rights of persons with disability, this potential was not being tapped or realized. Persons with disabilities continued being denied their human rights and were kept on the margins of society in all parts of the world. The Convention sets out the legal obligations on states to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities. It does not create new rights. In the Australian context, the document has indeed been used to reframe our legal framework as well as a background for the National Disability Insurance Scheme measures and standards. The purpose of the Convention from Article 1 is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Both a development and a human rights instrument, the Convention sets out a policy instrument which is cross-disability and cross-sectoral and is legally binding for countries that become signatories of the Convention. The Convention marks a paradigm shift in attitudes and approaches to persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities are not viewed as objects of charity, medical treatment, and social protection, rather as subjects with rights, who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions for their lives based on their free and informed consent, as well as being active members of society. The Convention gives universal recognition to the dignity of persons with disabilities. The Convention does not explicitly define disability. The preamble of the Convention states disability is an evolving concept, and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Article 1 of the Convention also states that persons with disabilities, including those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Disability then results from an interaction between a non-inclusive society and individuals. Persons using a wheelchair, for example, might have difficulties gaining employment, not because of the wheelchair, but because there are environmental barriers such as inaccessible buses or staircases that impede access. Persons with extreme nearsightedness who does not have access to corrective lenses may not be able to perform daily tasks. The same person with prescription eyeglasses would be able to perform all tasks without problems. Convention terminology discusses persons with disabilities and no longer uses the language of handicapped or physically or mentally challenged. Note these preferences for terminology among persons with disabilities and among geographic regions may vary. The individual wishes of persons with disabilities should be respected as much as possible. This is a really important insight. Respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and independence of persons, is a key principle. In Article 3, we also look at non-discrimination as a key principle, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of the human diversity and humanity, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, respect for evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. General principles in terms of participation and inclusion include participation is important to correctly identify specific needs and to empower the individual. Full and effective participation and inclusion in society is recognized in the Convention as a general principle, a general obligation, and a right. Looking at non-discrimination, the fundamental principle of international human rights law includes direct and indirect discrimination. Reasonable accommodation is a key concept that must be made for persons with disabilities. Reasonable accommodation means necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden where needed in a particular case, to ensure to persons with disabilities the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Regarding accessibility, important as a means to empowerment and inclusion, accessibility is both a general principle and a standalone article. Access must be ensured to justice, living independently and being included in the community, information and communication services, education, health, habilitation and rehabilitation, work and employment, human resource policies and practices, adequate standard of living and social protection, participation in political and social life, participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. The convention structure looks at a whole range of areas, and these slides detail the table of contents, which we won't go into in this presentation. The rights in the convention that are covered are quite a few. We have rights to equality before the law without discrimination, right to life, liberty, and security of persons, equal recognition before the law and legal capacity, freedom from torture, freedom from exploitation, violence, and abuse, right to respect physical and mental integrity, freedom of movement and nationality, right to live in the community. We notice that these rights are directly following on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that preceded this convention. We have discussed this in our previous lesson. Freedom of expression and opinion, respect for privacy, respect for home and the family, right to education, right to health, to work, to adequate standards of living, to participate in political and public life, to participate in cultural life. International cooperation includes international development programs that need to be inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities, focus on mainstreaming disability into all development activities, though disability-specific measures may be necessary to accelerate or achieve de facto equality of persons with disabilities. Millennium Development Goals are considered within this framework, and they will not be achieved if the persons with disabilities are not included in these developments. Protecting and improving and promoting human rights with limited resources. International human rights law recognizes the limitations on resources that exist within countries and in jurisdictions. Limitations on resources is not an excuse to delay implementation, however. Limited resources have to be prioritized according to reasonable and objective criteria, and funding must be proportional. Strategies for effective use of limited resources involve target low-cost programs, target people in the most marginalized situations, be non-discriminatory, draw on international cooperation, and include persons with disabilities in all stages. Mainstreaming disability in existing processes is a critical concept that's really, really important. State parties undertake to take into account the protection and promotion of the human rights of persons with disabilities in all policies and programs is a key principle from Article 4. Mainstreaming of disability issues according to the Convention involve the work of existing human rights treaty bodies, human rights councils, Millennium Development Goals, Common Country Assessments, poverty reduction strategies, the development of activities of international donors and non-government orgs, consensus data, sectoral and cross-sectoral policies, programs and policies for women and for children and others. The Convention promotes the notion of a no-gap approach. No entity can achieve the goal of equality for persons with disabilities on its own. There needs to be a cross-sectoral approach to this issue. An interconnected network of actors is required to reach these social goals. An example, in order for a person with disabilities using a wheelchair to access decent work, the person needs to be able to physically move in and out of his or her own home. They need to access public space and transportation, and they need to access work facilities, both the built environment and its information and communication systems. Different entities need to ensure that their respective spheres of responsibility provide the necessary opportunities and access to persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. If any one element of the network fails in this obligation, persons are not able to reap the benefits from the other elements. How accessible are the activities of my own organization? The Convention assists in reflection on these terms. Every aspect of an organization's activities must be analyzed to ensure accessibility and inclusion. A few examples. Do we require our partners' guarantees to have policies and practices in place to ensure inclusion of persons with disabilities? Do we collect data on the number of people with disabilities which benefit from our development activities? Do we design our development projects and programs to ensure that persons with disabilities can participate and benefit? We can see many applications of these principles within this course in terms of our self-reflection on our daily practice, but also on the environments that we work and live within, our home environment and our various work environments, and particularly now during 2020 as we're dealing with the social pressures of virus outbreaks and pandemics. We're looking at the use of technologies and telehealth and actually what is the accessibility there, what are the barriers, and how could these services be improved to assist people to access and to enjoy services and new choices and control of their situations. How accessible is my organization? To reflect on these, we might think a thorough analysis of every aspect of our organization must be necessary to ensure accessibility and inclusion. Are our human resource policies and practices accessible? Are our information communication systems accessible? Are our physical facilities accessible? We now would think that the protocol relating to these issues relies on individual communications as well as the relationships between people and their environments, and that the convention promotes a national monitoring and implementation of this convention and its standards. And in very many ways, in Australia, at least, the National Disability Insurance Scheme provides one of the main stakeholder groups within the country, both in terms of the service providers, the clinicians involved, particularly in our discussion of behavior support, and but most importantly, participants of the scheme and their carers and family and their support staff. Implementation in these frameworks really must look at accessibility and quality control, and how we can improve these contexts. And the key point here is nothing about us without us. That inclusion really demands that people with disabilities are at the center and the front of these movements and developments. So the challenge of implementing the convention is right now, and it's ongoing. The need for training, capacity building, awareness raising, and good practices collection and validation, knowledge and management are all really key considerations. And we see this in our work in a very big way on a day to day basis. There's a need to mainstream disability in all developmental activities, but there's also the need for the mainstream to become more particular, that is, more differential in its approach, more person centered. A lot of mainstream services can't just mainstream disability, it just doesn't work. What they really need is to understand the complexity and uniqueness of disability experiences and to tailor their services, their mainstream services, so that they match individuals' needs more so than the one size fits all just doesn't seem to work very well. There's a need for implementation of the convention principles in the internal operations of the National Disability Insurance Agency, and we're seeing more recent evaluations of the scheme, NDIS, raising a lot of these very issues. That the accountability and transparency, for example, in one of the recent reviews, was highlighted as a great need for the agency to change its approaches and become more transparent, more accountable, and more accessible for participants and their carers, families, and providers. There's a need to include persons with disabilities in all stages of implementation and build capacity of organizations of persons with disabilities to do so. We can't stress this enough. It's really very, very important. And here's a link for the resource for further information, which this slide is from the United Nations Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, www.un.org/disabilities. Excellent site with heaps of resources, and we highly recommend this to you. And thank you for your time. We look forward to your reflections and your questions and insights, sharing different information, links, and resources within our community. Thank you so much.